Why are high conflict moms labeled protective and high conflict dads labeled dangerous?
I think sometimes maybe women do go a little bit overboard to be protective, but I also don't think being a protective mom is a bad thing in some scenarios. But I do think what you're saying is they like to stir up situations, and it might even be a strategy to get a dad involved in a conversation and start an issue. Dangerous has so many different levels when we're talking about high conflict dads. I think at the point that they become dangerous, and I have seen so many examples, is when they're now threatening and they're harmful to the health and well-being of the children and to the mother. I'm watching the court systems not care about domestic violence at all anymore. In fact, I have seen with some of my clients, people, the other party, go and take random domestic violence classes, just random, and then that makes them okay. No, that's not even a court-ordered class. So I'm actually seeing the absolute opposite. In fact, it's frightening to me what I've seen with my clients and situations because nobody's listening to domestic violence anymore.
I just despise the misuse of restraining orders and fear and the leverage that it creates, because it really creates a much more difficult experience to manage your case for you, but also really for the other party, because it's a very, very steep climb.
Also, not handled through family court. So the judge just looks at it and says, oh, there is one, depending on what state you're in. I have a mother that I coach, and she has one against her for pretty much no reason, and it stuck. And it shouldn't have. And now she's in a position that's bad. But everybody else in that scenario that put it on her and lied, it was all false allegations, can now bully her with it.
I know people who have worked through this process. They scratch their face, or they punch their arm, or they smack their head off the
Right.
wall, call the cops, because that's how they think they can get out.
How about the guy that had his eyes done and they were little tiny like laser marks under his eyes and said that she scratched him? I'm like, look at the metadata. That guy had that done like years before you met him.
Exactly. There's definitely more awareness for abuse, right? We have to recognize those that need to be protected. But I also think that people have realized that in a flawed system, it's easily abused, it's easily leveraged. And so I think that it's happening more. And I think that we have more awareness of it too. Yeah, divorce in custody brings out the worst perceptions because it's always magnified, it's always misused. And if people could get to a point where they recognize your individual feelings, thoughts, emotions are not the priority, the children are, if children are involved, then I think generally speaking, the parents agree more often than they want to admit. And also, I think that if we were to go into these situations recognizing early that where you are once divorce and custody starts is not where you are when the relationship is in place. It's a completely brand new experience and world for both parties. And I think that is kind of the pivot point where things get a lot easier and a lot better for both sides the sooner both sides recognize it.
And I think ultimately too, it's one of those situations where the kids ultimately in the system become a weapon, right? Because the system is incentivizing one way or the other, whether it's financial, whether it's control, whether it's really those are the two big ones, right? Financial and control. And sometimes they're one and the same, right? It's the children become a weapon, right? The parents in a court system are not going to lean on what the kids want, what is best for the kids. Everything becomes litigious rather than parental. And the reason for that is people don't recognize that the new normal of being in court is you are forfeiting your decision-making power in a ton of categories, right? Religion, sports, activities, medical treatment, schools, schedules, travel, family, right? The list is extensive. And it's such a hard thing because when you get into a custody battle, what I find is the party that's most willing to align with what I would call the state, right? For lack of a better way to describe it, the state judge, officers, guardian ad litem, 730 evaluators, reintegration therapists, that's the state for all intents and purposes. The person who's most willing to align with whatever perspective the state holds is the one that's going to come out on top, right? The person who wants to stand on maybe principle or values or grounded positions, which, by the way, I would argue most of the time people are more in agreement than what they find in court. You're giving the power to somebody else.
Where do you put the child then? Which is exactly the situation I found my client in about 2 weeks ago when we were doing a lot of work, with rehabilitation and things, and she was doing a great job, but then she started talking about the other parent. And now we have CPS looking into both of them to see, are either one of them actually fit? Now where does the baby go?
Right.
And it's a 1.5-year-old. And
Well,
then the other thing I always say is on visitations, if there's a question and you have an ex that's retaliatory and constantly calls CPS, take pictures of your child after every parenting visit before you drop them off.
yes, absolutely. And again, those are difficult things to do because the opposing
don't want
side
to
can
know.
argue, right? Oh, well, I'm putting the kid through the process of pictures. And so there are some mechanics around that certainly we would coach our clients through.
Right.
And you can't, because the attorney's job is to put forward a legal argument and to represent your interests. And if you go to your attorney and you're saying it's X, Y, and Z, they're going to do their best job to make that argument. But they may not know all the details. They may not know your case, and they may not have the time, and you may not be paying them enough to focus on all of those minute details that could later in your case or along the way come back to bite you. So really making sure that you've got a coach, you've got a strategy, right? You know what your case looks like, where you're strong, where you're weak, and understanding what you're really trying to accomplish is the only way you're going to successfully navigate the family court system. I think the number one thing people don't recognize or consider when getting into the divorce process, what the pure expense of legal fees is going to turn into to fight, right? And so we'll talk about mediation and those other options later, but it's one of those things that ensuring you know what you know and you know how you're going to go about it is really important.
Right.
Things that people don't think about as cost, at least initially, right, are opportunity costs, lost time for work, right? How many hearings, if you had a 9 to 5 job, did you have to leave or take off to go be in a courtroom?
Or I have one. How many times did you have to pay a babysitter to come in and watch your child if you were in a court hearing?
Exactly. And now costs isn't always dollar cost, but emotional stress, right? That's an expense on your psyche. It's an expense on your peace of mind. That's a really expensive part of this. When it comes to divorce, it's not just pure equality, right? It's not going to be fair for either side. And so if you can get into that mentality, have a coach work through kind of what to expect, it makes it a lot easier. You'll probably save in a lot of places that you don't have to argue some of these tedious things. By the way, here's just a pure net benefit conversation. If it's a $10,000 argument, right, a $10,000 asset that you're going to argue over, figure out how to split it, even if you take less of a split, because you're going to spend 10 grand fighting over it.
I was going to say, it's not worth fighting over it. Not at all.
Exactly. And by the way, no offense to attorneys, they're not going to tell you to stop fighting over it because they're not incentivized to do that. They're incentivized to represent your interest. Your interest is a portion of whatever that is. You're going to pay them over here and you're going to split whatever it is left.
And there'll be nothing left then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But do lawyers encourage false allegations behind the scenes to gain leverage? And how common is it really? Now, my opinion is this. Yes, lawyers absolutely recognize the leverage that false allegations bring to their case to the benefit of their client. Now, I'm going to take the position that it's probably optimistic that most attorneys would not just outright recommend to their clients
You
to
can't.
make false allegations, right?
Yes, you cannot.
Because it's an interesting question, and it is the rise in abuse allegations during divorce a sign of greater awareness or greater manipulation?
So just keep wanting to hit me with these, don't you? I think that there's a point where it can be manipulation. And I think when I say this, it's going to sound a little off kilter. Typically, when a woman's really being abused, they are not calling the police constantly. They really aren't, because they're staying there, and we can look at coercive control and we can talk about narcissistic abuse. But for the most part, a woman, and maybe a man too, won't just start calling the police. So that is not manipulation. When they're constantly calling the police for no reason, that's the manipulation piece. I think 50-50 is kind of the fall of the whole family system, court system. But I also believe that both parents need to have contact and be with their kids. But I do think that the 50-50 presumption does put children sometimes into the hands of people that are unsafe. And we've talked about this before, and unfortunately, like I said, it's mostly fathers, but not all the time. It doesn't have to be. But if a parent is unsafe, they need a supervisor, and they don't get 50-50 unsupervised. And I will never not stand behind that.
Yeah, and I'm a big advocate. This is where we definitely disagree. I'm a big advocate that
I know we do.
the presumption should absolutely be 50-50. Now, and I say that because unless proven otherwise is the key element to that point. If there is a situation where it's unsafe, if it is detrimental to the kids, then you should be able to prove it.